This is the Naked Mormon History Travel Log for March 27th, 2017. Today was primarily a driving day as I was making my way from Nauvoo down to Missouri. However, there was one amazing stop in between, and that was Carthage Jail. Wow, Carthage Jail was fantastic. One thing that hit me so much with Nauvoo is this is the finality of it. This is, Joseph's magnum opus. That's what I said and described it as in the last travel log. But this Carthage, that was the final end point. That was where it truly all came crashing down, where so much, any plans that Joseph Smith had, any ideas of what he wanted to do or where he wanted to take the church all came to a screeching halt. And so many people couch it as Joseph knew that he was going out to die, that this would be the time that he wasn't going to be able to escape this jail. And, Joseph said when pretty much any time that he was becoming incarcerated that he was going to die. When he was being arrested and taken to the Richmond Court of Inquiry in November of 1838, not only he, but Emma and Lucy Mack Smith, they were both well convinced that he was going to die and be killed by the mobs, but they were state-sanctioned militias, so he had certain protections. But, he had cried wolf many, many times. It just so happened that this time there happened to be a wolf, and Joseph and Hiram both were shot and killed. John Taylor was shot, I believe it was 4 times, or he had 4 bullets in him. He may have been shot more times. The bullets had passed through, but he was shot 4 times. And then Willard Richards, the cousin to Brigham Young, the magnificent meat shield that he was, didn't, suffer any damage except for a bullet apparently grazed his earlobe. Now, in going through the tour of Carthage, it was fascinating because there's nothing really Mormon history related around it, because nothing happened in Carthage except for the Carthage Jail shootout, the gunfight. And so I'll tell you kind of what the tour encapsulated. The tour started in the visitor center, where they had a couple of missionaries that showed us this, I guess you can call it an impactful movie that was essentially an editorialized version of Jeffrey R. Holland's 2009 conference speech, October 2009 conference speech, and he holds up the original Book of Mormon that Hiram Smith had, and Hiram Smith apparently read a verse out of it to Joseph and dog-eared the page, and that page is still dog-eared to this day, and, Holland was holding up that book and just championing how amazing it is. He also went on saying that, I'm sure the clip is extant out there in the form that I saw it, but he said, would these people all die for a farce, essentially? Would Joseph Smith all die if it were a con for it? I said that wrong. Would Joseph Smith die for this if it were all just a con, if he were a grand con man? And my answer to that is, people die for false things all the time. I mean, and if you're judging the truth of something based on how willing somebody is to die for that, whatever, specific claim, shouldn't Islam be the true church? Because they've had, in recent history, thousands of martyrs. And before that, I'm sure there are various sects of Christianity of which I'm not historically certain of, but I'm sure there have been Christian martyrs, and there have been Buddhist and Hindu martyrs. There have been plenty of other martyrs of plenty religions. It just so happens that Islam is in the forefront of the political and social eye right now, with, being the most publicly out martyr-centric religion. So in that respect, shouldn't Islam be the one true church? I mean, the founding prophet died for the church, but he died for so much more. I mean, he was incarcerated in that prison for many, many reasons. Very little of it had to do with the fact that he claimed to be a prophet. I mean, he had burned down a printing press. That was an act of tyranny. I mean, that in and of itself was a major problem. He was having sex with so many women. He was marrying so very many women, and there's no way to tell if he was limited to just the women that he was, marrying, or if there were others on the side that, that we have absolutely no proof of one way or another. And we wouldn't expect to find any proof of unless it's, hidden away in some journals that are still hiding in somebody's trunk, the thing is, like, Joseph had made so many enemies. It's really not a mystery that he was shot and killed. It was the West. It was the West of the United States. They were on the Western frontier. It was the Wild West. We picture that as like 1860s, 70s, and 80s out in Utah and, the territories before they were states. But, I mean, Independence, Missouri, and Illinois, and, the states were pretty much, the border of the Mississippi River. That was pretty much the Wild West frontier. That's how people settled disagreements with each other. Andrew Jackson famously had many duels. And I mean, he at the time he died, he had a number of bullets still in his body from the various duels he had. I mean, people settled things oftentimes with bullets. And we can stand somebody like Joseph Smith up on a pedestal and hold a ceremony for him, but he's no different than, many other people that were, shot because, it wasn't as illegal back then as it is now. There wasn't much justice in the way that we see justice today. So the tour itself was quite interesting. And that I guess kind of ends my comments on the Jeffrey R. Holland video. He just said that, never mind the all of the things they were leaving behind, never mind the fact that they had, built this church and everything. Would they have died if this were false? And the answer to that is they didn't die willingly. They had no choice in whether or not they were going to die, as is the case with everybody that dies, right? I mean, the anti-Nephi Lehites, who in the Book of Mormon, walked out from their city, their fortified city, and just got slaughtered wholesale by the Lamanites. They just knelt down and prayed while the Lamanites ran and cut off all their heads until the Nephites defended them. That is a fictional story. And it's fun to think of, but I don't think that has ever actually happened in human history because it runs so incredibly counter to human instincts. And when your life is threatened, your instincts are the only thing that matters. So, pretty much everybody dies unwillingly, Martyrs, most of the times martyrs aren't dying willingly. I guess in the most... in the sense of the word martyr. So somebody who willingly does kill themselves for a given cause or an ideology. The ideal is that they are killing themselves for it, but oftentimes they're surrounded by people that are telling them that if they don't kill themselves, if they don't do something that causes them to be a martyr, then they won't get to heaven. So that's not willing. That's pointing a gun to somebody's head and telling them to do something or else you'll kill them. Only with an eternal sense, that's an eternity gun pointed at their head. That's not willingness. That's a very convoluted and indescribably twisted mindset to be in. And there's so many compounding psychological factors that lead a person to become what we consider a willing martyr. But those people. That we would picture today that might strap bombs to themselves and go walk into a crowded market and kill themselves, becoming a martyr. They're not doing it. I mean, on a superficial sense, maybe they're doing it willingly, but in the grand scheme of things, it's all under duress. It's all with the threat of hellfire and eternal torture. So calling Joseph Smith a martyr is a complete misnomer of the situation. And, I guess that's all I'm going to say about Jeffrey Holland's video. So we walk into the tour and we first walked into what was called the summer kitchen, because there's the winter and summer kitchen, because on hot Illinois or Missouri days when the humidity is 100 and the degrees are 100 in Fahrenheit, you don't want to cook inside because you'll bake everybody, and not in a good way. So they had an actual summer kitchen where it was just essentially right off of the building, and that's where they would cook in the summer to keep the heat out of the main living dwelling. So we started in the summer kitchen, then we went into the main kitchen area and the living area on the bottom floor of the jail. And that was, interesting. They had a few time specific, desks and chairs, some silverware that was, looked old timey. It's probably the majority of its reproduction. But it did, it gave you a sense for what it would have looked like back in the time that Joseph was there. And then after that, we walked up the stairs. And being an old building, the stairs are, steep and small. No, there's no like walking past as somebody on them. They're narrow and they're very, very steep. So we walked up the stairs, and the first room that we entered was what was essentially the dungeon. And it was just that. The room itself was all, hardened bricks all the way around, with just little tiny slits cut in the bricks to allow some ventilation, but obviously not enough. There was a cage in there as well, actual bars and a locking mechanism and a full cage system in there as well, along with a straw bed and, a chamber pot and a couple other little things here and there. And that was the dungeon. And that was where Willard Richards put John Taylor in his broken and Swiss cheese-like state after he was shot so many times. That's where Willard Richards hid John Taylor, in that dungeon underneath a mattress. So after we, sat around the holding cell in the dungeon, and the missionary related a special story, just like all of them do, that's not pertinent to the history, but is a spiritual and rich story, and it is obviously motivated by the narrative of what they're trying to claim in this whole Carthage Jail situation. And then after that, we finally walked into the room where they were martyred, and at first impression, the only thing I can say is it was underwhelming. I thought that when I walked in there, I was going to have this kapow sense of historical comprehension that would just punch me in the face, but it didn't happen. I was expecting to have a feeling of, oneness come over me, just with okay, so let me back up. There were a few places in Nauvoo where I just felt this sense of awe and wonder, where just looking at what's in front of me is just so incredibly profound. One of those was in the John Taylor home. There's pictures of this up on the Facebook page. The John Taylor home, there is a little wooden rocking horse. And the sister missionary told a story of how John Taylor made this for one of his daughters, and then it was shipped across the plains to go with John Taylor out to Utah, and then it was recovered in the 1960s or something, and it was shipped back to Nauvoo in order to be put in the John Taylor home. And, just the sense of the history behind this little tiny rocking horse, and, just my imagination running wild, seeing a little girl rocking back and forth and playing on this thing, because it would have been such a wonder to have a toy like that for a child living in Nauvoo with, everything that the saints had to deal with when they were living there. This amazing sense of peace and just oneness with the history. It just overpowered me. It was absolutely amazing. I got chills thinking about, just the history encapsulated in this one little tiny wooden horse. And I thought I would get that same sense when I went into Carthage, but it simply didn't happen. We got into the main holding cell where the martyrdom, the gunfight actually happened. And the elder there pointed out the holes in the door. There's a hole in the lock mechanism, as well as a hole just in the center of it, which is apparently the hole that traveled through the door and pierced Hiram Smith in the head, killing him nearly instantly. And he just pointed out these couple of things, and then he pressed play, and there was this audio track that played. And it was just so Mormon. That's the only way I could describe it. It was perfectly Mormon. It was exactly what I expected it to be, because it read, I think it was Willard Richards' account of the martyrdom, essentially, and then it synthesized what happened, just with an announcer's voice, essentially, this really compelling and powerful voice. And then and they said Joseph asked Willard Richards, or maybe it was John Taylor, to sing a hymn, and the person completely a cappella sang "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief," which I think that is historically verifiable, that one of them did sing that to Joseph Smith. Maybe it wasn't Willard Richards. It may have been one of the other men that were locked in there before they left the morning of the gunfight. I can't remember the specifics of it. This is the problem. I haven't studied Carthage in detail yet. But so apparently the person sang "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief," and the person in this little audio track sang it. And that was so Mormon, because it was just like this, you could tell they were trying to incite this spiritual feeling and get people in that headspace where they can feel the spirit and they can know the sacrifice, supposedly, that Joseph Smith made for them here on this spot. And, after it was done playing, the elder, the announcer said a couple of things, and the elder pointed to the things silently while the audio track was talking through them. But after it was done, he just sat there and then just kind of said, "Are there any questions?" Before the next tour group comes up, because we need to get going. And that was my opportunity, because when somebody asks, "Are there any questions?" when they have said half truths or haven't told the truth, that is where I want to skepticize things. So I asked a couple of pointed questions. The very first one was, why did they replace the floorboard where Hyrum Smith's blood spot was? Because it's very apparent that they replaced that floorboard. You can see where that floorboard used to be, where his blood spot used to be. They, for a long time, they used to say this is Joseph Smith's blood, and then once they realized that wasn't historically viable, they covered it up with a rug. And then once they realized that people were, too many people were asking questions, or people wanted to see the blood spot, then they just straight up replaced the floorboard. They pulled out the old original Carthage Jail floorboard, built in the early 1800s, and put in a new one. And you can see it. You can very clearly see it's a different wood grain. It has round nail holes instead of the square nail heads or the diamond-shaped nail heads that they used back in the days. All of the nail heads on all the other boards are worn down and shiny from people walking across them, but this one board has circular nail holes, and the holes are, the nails are driven further down into the board. You can't see the shiny nail heads poking up. It's very apparent that they deliberately changed this floorboard to what? To revise the history? That's historical revisionism, and that's the one thing that can actually get me riled up and angry about something, is when you revise history, when you're with a motivation, with ideologically revising something that happened, or telling a story in a certain way because you're trying to hide the facts of something. So I asked the elder directly, why did they replace the floorboard with Hyrum Smith's blood spot on it? And he came back with what I guess was an okay response. He said, because people were focusing too much on the blood and the vengeance, and it was ruining the spirit of the sacrifice that Joseph Smith made. It's the same reason why the church does so many things with the history and tells the history why they do, is because sometimes the real history isn't as compelling, or is it doesn't allow you a sense of that spiritual oneness the way that they want it to. So they decide to change the facts of something to comport more with their reality. You see the point that I'm driving at here? This is what I was so frustrated at. The second question that I asked him was, why didn't you tell us, or sorry, I didn't say, why didn't you tell us? That's too accusatory. I stopped myself from asking that. I'm trying to remember exactly how I said the question. Essentially, I said, "What about the guns that Joseph Smith and the pistol that Joseph Smith had, and the Derringer that Hiram Smith had? Joseph Smith shot 3 people and killed 2 of them, and I think calling it a martyrdom is a misnomer because it was a gunfight." The various Mormons sitting in there didn't like the question, but the missionary said, well, there's a little bit of historical conjecture. Essentially, he didn't use those terms specifically, but he said there's competing narratives or something to that effect, and we aren't really sure about the guns. And, of course, that was not a good enough answer for me, but I wanted to ask another question, so I just let it slide, and I could tell that the people were not too pleased with these questions. So my third and final question to him was, what do you say to people that claim Joseph Smith made the Masonic cry for help before he fell out of the window? And he said, that's factual. Bam. He just hit me with, that is factual. That was probably the most stunning answer and the most unexpected answer that I could have gotten out of this elder. He just said that Joseph Smith made the Masonic cry for help right before he tumbled out of the window. Not many Mormons know that. They sure as hell didn't say that when they were telling us about the story. It required me knowing that, or somebody in the group knowing that, and asking a directly pointed question in order for them to just agree to it. And I think that probably captures the historical revisionism the most. Another point was, and I wanted to hit on this, but we were completely out of time. I couldn't ask my fourth question was, John Taylor, there's famously a pocket watch that he had, and supposedly this pocket watch was shot, somebody who was shooting at him, the bullet hit the pocket watch, and that caused John Taylor to tumble back into the room and then roll under the bed. That's simply not true. There's not a bullet hole in that watch. The watch is broken because John Taylor fell on it. That no bullet actually struck that. And that's something that Mormons often tout, is this miraculous pocket watch that probably saved John Taylor's life. It didn't. He just fell on it. So that was one thing that was just a blatant lie that I was very frustrated with. But of course we were out of time and I couldn't ask that fourth and final question. After that, we were done with the tour. We left and walked out, and I went out and took a bunch of pictures and a 360 video, which will be posted soon. And I proceeded to speak with the elder a bit more, just talking to him about the history and about when we were outside in the main square of Carthage Jail there. I just kind of talked to him a little bit more about the history and, told him kind of my story through, Mormon studies. And I've told him that I've been studying it now for 4.5 years, and it's so liberating to know that every time I learn something, I realize there's so much more that I don't know. And I told him that I do this podcast. I told him that I do so many, I've been studying this for a while, and this is the first time that I've gone through the Mormon history tour. And, it was a really fruitful and pleasant conversation after the fact, but nobody in the group, none of those Mormons in the group heard that conversation that we were having. And by the end of it, he had essentially said that we try and tell the history as it is here, but we don't want to take away from the spirit that people will feel here. And I told him, honestly, I said, well, I'm a storyteller by trade, and sometimes the facts get in the way of a good story, but I don't let it stop me from telling what really happened. And, maybe that's kind of what, and maybe that distinguishes him and me apart, because he's telling a narrative with a certain motivation. I'm telling a narrative with a certain motivation. He is hiding certain historical facts, and I'm trying to bring certain historical facts to the light, because I think the history is much more compelling when we know the totality of it, when we know of the controversies. So, yeah, that was essentially, that was Carthage. I took quite a few pictures, walked around the visitor center a little bit. It's a small visitor center, and there's nothing else in Carthage, Illinois, except for the jail that is as far as Mormon history goes. I think there was a gas station, maybe a motel, but and burger and shake shop. But yeah, that was today. It wasn't quite as eventful as Nauvoo. I didn't get to see as many things, but tomorrow will be Independence and Liberty Jail and Adamant-Diamond and Far West and Hans Mill. Wow. Wow, wow. Yeah, it's going to be exciting. I'm super stoked about it. But we'll keep this audio log a little bit shorter than last night's. Thanks for listening.